Hello dear watchers, and welcome to my video on mental health organizations to avoid or support. Obviously, there are a shitload of mental health organizations out there, so this list is focused on organizations in the United States, as that's where I live, that have a nationwide reach. As part of my research for this video, I googled best mental health organizations or similar, then looked further into the organizations that came up in the results. I'm not including organizations like Autism Speaks that I have already talked about extensively as being horrible. Not to mention, autisticness is not a mental health condition, it's a developmental disability. I'm going to start out with the organizations to avoid and finish with the ones to support so we can end on a good note. I'm listing the sources I used in the video description. I also want to discuss what criteria I researched when it came to these organizations. The biggest problems I see with mental health organizations are perpetuating sanism against personality disorders, especially cluster B ones, and autmisia, which is weird because, as I've said, autisticness is a developmental disability, not a mental illness. So for each of the organizations I looked into, I started by looking at what they said about autism and personality disorders. This quickly got very depressing. I've mentioned on my This Is For You, Carrie blog that ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, the quote, gold standard, quote, treatment for autistic children, is abusive. Specifically, I've said the following. ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, is an abusive practice in psychiatry that is a form of conversion therapy to force autistic people to act allistic. ABA often uses aversives such as forcing autistic children to taste Tabasco sauce, and the actual techniques for ABA were based on dog training. ABA misunderstands autisticness. It is based on the idea that autisticness is a behavioral disorder and not a neurotype. The inventor of ABA, Ole Ivar Lovaas, I don't know if I'm saying that right and I don't fucking care, has said, autistic children are severely disturbed. You see, you start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic child. You have a person in the physical sense. They have hair, a nose, and a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. One way to look at the job of helping autistic kids is to see it as a matter of constructing a person. You have the raw materials, but have to build the person. I also referenced a paper, which I will link in the video description, about how ABA causes PTSD. No ABA is okay. Some ABA child torturers, providers, insist that their ABA is play-based or reward-oriented. Use of aversives is more obviously evil than this, but even quote play-based or quote reward-oriented ABA is based on the flawed idea that autisticness is a behavioral disorder and that as such, you can make a person not autistic by changing their behavior. This is like saying that colored contacts permanently change a person's eye color. An autistic child who has been conditioned by ABA to act allistic by forcing eye contact, not playing in ways that are rewarding for them, not stimming, etc. is still autistic. They're just also suffering because they're no longer able to express themselves. In conclusion, hashtag ABA is never okay, and ABA is extremely autmisic. Mental health organizations that support and/or recommend ABA include Child Mind Institute, a nonprofit aimed at supporting and helping children with mental illnesses or developmental disabilities, and National Alliance on Mental Illness, which claims to be the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization dedicated to building better lives for the millions of Americans affected by mental illness. The National Alliance on Mental Illness also notes how much more common autisticness supposedly is in, quote, boys, as opposed to, quote, girls. Not only eliding autistic adults, but also ignoring the fact autistic people who aren't cis boys or cis men are underdiagnosed. Autisticness is not a condition that can be medicated. Sometimes autistic children are chemically restrained with antipsychotics, this is medical abuse, but you can't medicate a person to make them less or not autistic. Autistic people are prone to co-occurring conditions, many of which, e.g. depression, can be medicated in many cases. But the National Institute of Mental Health, part of the NIH, claims that medication can treat, quote, irritability, aggression, and repetitive behaviors in autistic people. The National Institute of Mental Health Also links to clinical trials for drugs aimed at being eugenic, quote, cures for autisticness. The Brain and Behavior Foundation, a nonprofit that funds research on mental illness, funds research for eugenic, quote, cures for autisticness as well. This one especially hurt, as I donated to the Brain and Behavior Foundation for research on bipolar disorder in Carrie Fisher's memory when Carrie passed. Also, remember how I said earlier that many mental health organizations perpetuate anti-cluster B sanism? The National Institute of Mental Health, which I mentioned earlier, does that shit. Specifically, they suggest that family members of people with borderline personality disorder need therapy to deal with how traumatic it is to be related to a BPD sufferer. The Semicolon Project is also anti-cluster B. Well, really, it promotes eliminationist attitudes toward mental illness. As someone whose mental illnesses pretty unilaterally suck, I haven't gotten into mad pride much, but I do know that a stated goal of eliminating mental illness is some fucked up eugenics shit. I did poke around their website as research for this video, and I can no longer find the eugenicist language on their site, but I distinctly remember seeing it when planning entries for my This Is For You Carrie blog 6 years ago. So it's possible that they have improved, but I would still tread carefully. I mentioned earlier that learning about the Brain and Behavior Foundation's Autmisia hurt because I had donated to them, but I haven't mentioned the organization whose fuckery hurt the most. That organization is the Trevor Project. As a queer person who was suicidal, all throughout my youth and teen years, I needed a resource like the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project even makes an effort to understand and include asexuality, which I really, really appreciate as someone who used to be suicidal over my inability to understand sexual attraction. But the Trevor Project recently laid off approximately 12% of bargaining unit employees, which was reportedly the culmination of increasingly anti-worker behavior. So that sucks. Finally, I've saved the most surprisingly fucked up for last. The Treatment Advocacy Center is an organization that claims to work toward eliminating barriers to treatment for so-called severe mental illness. The founder of this organization wrote an op-ed about how, quote, untreated mental illness causes people to commit mass shootings. Yes, really, and this is not only bullshit, it is harmful, sanist bullshit. Statistics show that mentally ill people are far more likely to be the victims of violence than perpetrators. I've discussed that in a blog entry which I will link in the video description. There are a couple of organizations I want to mention, but about which I want to say, proceed with caution. The first is To Write Love on Her Arms. I have heard that the treacly story of Renee is at least partly fabricated, but I have no proof of that. I also hate how Extion the organization is, i.e., but we will be her church, the body of coming alive to meet her needs, to write love on her arms. But I have no proof that they proselytize to the people they're claiming to help or any other Extion hegemony bullshit. I have also heard that they're sellouts, especially with regard to their involvement with the pop-punk scene, but again, I don't know if that's true or if they actually helped the mental health of the kids who were listening to depressing music because they were depressed. So, the things I've heard about TWLOHA leave a bad taste in my mouth, but I don't have any hard evidence that the organization sucks. The other Proceed with Caution organization I want to mention is Mental Health America. They aren't as bad about personality disorders as they could be, although they say that people with NPD, quote, tend to exploit interpersonal relationships. They cite actual autistic people regarding autisticness, but unfortunately, those people are John Elder Robeson, who encourages autistic activists to cave to the pressures of ableist parents, and Temple Grandin, who is an Aspie supremacist. So I'm not pleased about either of those things, but they do have mental health resources specifically for BIPOC, which is absolutely critical and which I haven't seen in any other of the organizations I researched. Now onto the actually decent organizations. Well, somewhat decent. The whole non-profit industrial complex is rotten to the core and complicit in the gatekeeping of resources, but with that in mind, these are the best that I could find. The first one I want to talk about is Trans Lifeline. Trans Lifeline is a suicide hotline that is specifically for transgender people. Unlike every other suicide hotline I am aware of, Trans Lifeline will never call the pigs on a suicidal person. The only reason I didn't put every other suicide hotline on the bad list is because I can't find any evidence that any of them call the pigs for any reason besides the person who called is unwilling to make a safety plan, which isn't nearly as bad as I feared. Trans Lifeline is also both for and by trans people. You won't call and get a cis person who has no idea what you're going through. It's a good time to donate to them if you can, considering the ongoing genocide of trans people in the States. An organization that I worked with in college is Active Minds, a nonprofit that focuses on mental health in young people, especially high school and college students. They hold events for schools and have resources for finding therapy and engaging in self-care, among other things. They don't have the most detailed information on mental illness out there, but what they have is accessible to young people who may be suffering. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention seems to have its shit together too. AFSP is focused on, well, suicide prevention. AFSP has resources not just for people who are suicidal, but people who have lost loved ones to suicide, and people who want to support loved ones who are suicidal. They also have references in multiple languages. Another organization that seems to have its shit together is the National Council for Behavioral Health. Their website says that they help to advance the behavioral health and human services field, and that seems to be the story. NCBH mostly focuses on substance use disorder. Their website also has one of the most nuanced, respectful, compassionate outlooks on substance use disorder that I've seen. Considering that Carrie Fisher was the initial inspiration for me writing my This Is For You, Carrie blog, an outlook on substance use disorder that doesn't suck is particularly important to me. National Coalition for Mental Health Recovery is an interesting one. I'm not a huge fan of the name. Not every mental health condition can be, quote, recovered from, and the focus on, quote, recovery can alienate people with those conditions, but I like their mission. NCMHR's website says, "We ensure that consumers/survivors have a major voice in the development and implementation of healthcare, mental health, and social policies at the state and national levels." They have webinars on things like building peer support ecosystems and the dearth of adequate mental health treatment in rural America. They also have an organizing guide for psychiatric survivors, and their activists do things like decrying the role of police in mental health crises. I can absolutely get behind all of those things. And I don't have a good way to end this video. I guess it's good that not all of the organizations that I researched sucked, because I was genuinely afraid that that would happen. Also, if you have to support just one of the good organizations, I would pick Trans Lifeline because of the aforementioned ongoing genocide. Go forth and make good choices about mental health nonprofits. Eternal thanks to my wonderful Patreon supporters, Ace, Atia, Emily, Hannah, Max, and Sid. It's only $1 a month to be as cool as them, and you'll also get perks like seeing blog entries and videos 2 days early, and being able to vote in polls on my next entry/video topics. Thanks for watching! Bye!